10 Days in the USA is a classic family game from designers Alan R. Moon and Aaron Weisblum that was released by Out of the Box Publishing in 2003, which feels like an era ago, given how quickly games come and go on this market today in 2019. 10 Days was quite successful. It went through many different editions over a decade period of time. It was on the market all that time. There were many different spin-offs where people could travel to different locations. Gameplay was similar across all the titles in the line, but there were some differences, and you can also combine them into a larger game. 20 days in the US and Africa, 40 days around Asia and Europe and Africa and the Americas. However you wanted to combine them, you could do that to make this larger game. You could upplay or downplay the educational element depending on who you were talking to. Teachers, yes, you should definitely carry this in the classroom because kids will blah, 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 and they'll figure out planning and logistics. Kids, come have fun. We go around the world. There's all sorts of ways to talk about the game in various ways. But Out of the Box Publishing went out of business in 2015, and the games disappeared from the market. Now, Broadway Games, a publisher in Hong Kong, has the rights to the series and is bringing them out again, as you see in this Chinese English edition that's been released in Hong Kong. There's a Korean edition coming. Other editions will probably come as well. 10 Days in Europe is also coming back before the end of 2019, at least in Hong Kong. The gameplay is the same. It just has new artwork, as you see, by Jackie Davis. A new look to it. Much more stylish than the somewhat pedestrian look of the 2003 edition, but the gameplay is identical. How does it work? 10 Days in the USA is one of those games that makes sense if you approach it from the ending point and you understand that first. The game ends as soon as someone creates a valid 10-day tour. The name of the game, after all, is 10 Days in the USA, and you must spend those 10 days in a valid manner as described by the game. The game includes 50 state cards, one for each of the 50 US states. There are some cars, there are some airplanes in the 5 colors of most of the states on the board, and this is an example of a valid tour. You must start and end in a state, because of course you do not begin a trip in midair. No, you start on land. So we have Oregon, and then next is California. Those two states are adjacent to one another, so this is a valid connection. You can use a car to serve as another state that's between the two states touching it. So California, car, Nevada. So this car could be Oregon or Arizona, doesn't really matter, but you have a valid connection. An airplane is used to connect two states of the same color. So from Nevada, I take the blue airline, JetBlue, I guess, to go to Georgia. And there are also green and pink and orange. I don't know what kind of airline stays in business this way, but whatever. Game terms. You go from Nevada to Georgia. Georgia is next to Florida, so I can put those cards next to one another. I'm going to use a car to connect Florida and Alabama because a state is adjacent to both of them. And then from Alabama, we touch Tennessee. Done. That's a valid connection, and you also know pretty much most of the rules of the game. What you are trying to do is build a tour like this. So if you end up having Oregon next to Tennessee, you know those two are not connected. So you must fix that. The only odd parts of the US are, of course, Alaska and Hawaii, because they are not part of the continental 48 states. You can reach them only by airplane. So if you had something like this, we'll pretend the rest of this is valid here, I can go from Nevada on the blue airplane to Hawaii, and then I could always have a green airplane that connects to a green state, and then carry on from there. So Tennessee, there we go. I got the rest of it all together. So Hawaii just needs to be reached through some airplane, and then you leave through some airplane, unless of course Hawaii is at the beginning and end of your tour. When 10 Days in the USA first appeared in 2003, I recall it being described as Geography Racco. I don't even know if people are familiar with Racco anymore. It seemed much more common and sort of a touch point in the game industry in 2003. Everyone knew what Racco was, but I don't recall seeing Racco on the market at all. I guess someone needs to bring that back as well. Racco was a simple game where you'd have a rack. You would have cards with numbers on them. You deal out cards, you put them in your rack, and on a turn you're going to draw a card from the discard pile of the deck, possibly replace a card in your rack, and you're trying to get all the cards in order from low to high. That's it. Extremely straightforward. You have the integers. They only go in one order, at least for purposes of this game. And that was it. 10 Days in the USA, of course, has a lot more openness to it because the states don't have an order. Unless, of course, you're ordering them by population or size. But we're not doing that here. All it is traveling from one to the other. So Oregon, California is fine, as is California, Oregon. It's all about putting everything together to make that trip happen. So how do you start? Setup for 10 Days in the USA is straightforward. Lay out the board so that everyone can easily see how the states connect to one another. So you don't have to visualize it. Each player takes a 2-part rack. You shuffle all the cards face down, and then you just dive in, draw a card, place it somewhere on your rack. And draw another card, place that somewhere, and you continue until you have placed 10 cards. And of course, you are probably not making connections as you initially place things, but you can try to make it happen. So here, I can do this. It's not a race, but of course, you are watching me play, and so I'm going to try to make it happen here before too long. Oh boy, that didn't work at all. All right. So I've got a couple of things that connect. You don't know what those are because, of course, I am looking at my tiles. I'll show them to you so you can see. Nothing really worked out. I drew some nice transportation with the airplane, with the cars. I have Nevada here, driving up to Montana. I have a car from Montana to something, and then a yellow plane to something else. So I have the beginnings of a tour, some connections in here, because I could place either Oregon or South Dakota or Utah in this space, where I'm going from Nevada, driving through Idaho to Montana, and then I'm going to drive to South Dakota or to Utah or to Oregon. And then since I have a yellow plane here, I can put any yellow card that I want at the end. The beginning doesn't make, it makes no sense right now. It's just drawing stuff at random. So how you play the game is you're going to have the face down pile. You have 3 face up discard piles. And on a turn, you can draw a face down card, or you can draw the top card of a discard pile. Nope, does not work. Oh, nope. Trying to look here. What can I do? Nope, nothing's working. We can do this. I can replace Minnesota with Virginia. So now this is valid. Montana, I drive through one of the Dakotas to get to Minnesota. This doesn't match, but if I get a green plane, I can swap that. Or if I get one of these yellow states, I can swap that. You're trying to make connections as you go and then build upon that. If I draw from the pile, I look at it, I see whether I think it's going to help me. If not, I put it in one of the discard piles. If you draw from the last discard piles, if there's none available, then whatever you discard has to go in that space. And you're going to continue drawing cards and discarding until someone completes their 10-day tour. That's it for the rules of 10 Days in the USA, aside from a few corner cases, such as the states in the Four Corners region. States that are diagonally touching are not considered adjacent for the purposes of this game. You cannot use a car to connect Maine and New Hampshire because there's no intervening state between them. Maine touches New Hampshire, and that's it. Maine, in this game, is not very useful. Maine itself is beautiful, but in this game, useless. And that's what you learn as you play the game. I've played more than 50 times on the original game and some games on the new edition as well. And you really get familiar with what's connected to what if you didn't know that already. You look at the board and you see Missouri and Tennessee each touch 8 states. They are fabulous in terms of making connections. And then you have other things like Maine, Florida, just touches Georgia and Alabama. Not that useful. You go out in the West, you got these giant states that don't touch very much. It's really more the east. That's where all the connections are. But you can see the connections more easily the more that you play. You start learning how to build your rack in order to have multiple possible connections come up, as in my example where I could get a green plane and then I could travel on from Minnesota, or I could get one of those 3 yellow states and then connect with the yellow plane. So you're trying to build in the possible combinations here rather than start from the beginning and just build step by step, because that will take you forever and probably never work, versus someone who has played the game a bunch of times and is sort of building things organically. Sometimes when you have the initial setup, I've had games that are nearly complete. I did one recently where I had to swap only 2 cards in order to make a connection. And again, I've played a bunch, so I'm familiar with that and can build things more readily as you're setting up. When you're setting up, for example, you want to put states at the beginning and end, because of course you need that in order to have a tour. If you draw a plane, don't put it in the first or last slot. Put it in the 2nd or 9th slot, because then you can put a state of any color on that outer slot and it's a valid connection. So you're kind of building already the tour as you're drafting the cards. And sometimes the draft will work better than others and the game will end in a few turns, or it'll take much longer. So there's a lot of variability in here. It's a very low-key game, except you can play it as a little more less low-key, high-key, where you're blocking people, you see what they're picking up, you try to imagine what they're building because you can see where they're slotting it into their rack. They just put Kentucky here. Oh, the person who went before me discarded Tennessee. Well, clearly I'm going to cover Tennessee with my discard, whatever that is. You generally don't want to discard planes and cars because they are very useful in connecting all sorts of things. But sometimes you have to, because you got to make that connection yourself. So you got to build it up. So there's a lot of variability and randomness to how the game plays out, but you can play better as you play more and as you are more observant to what people are doing. Let me talk a little bit about the differences between the new 2019 edition versus the original one. Here's a comparison of the components in the Broadway Games edition of 10 Days in the USA and the one from Out of the Box Publishing. The game consists only of game board, cards, and racks, and there's differences in all of them. What has not changed is the colors of the states themselves. So if you have played the original version of 10 Days in the USA, all those colors remain the same in the new version, and I'm not sure why they would ever have changed it, given that it makes sense to have a continuance from one game to the other. All the connections are there. I'm sure that Moon and Wiseblum had reasons for why California and Colorado and Idaho were all red. Make sure that things connect in various ways, and that is retained in the newest edition. The game board itself is a lot more colorful, rather than just plain names on an empty map. You now have landmarks showing in each of the states, and those landmarks are replicated on the state cards themselves. Whereas in the older out-of-the-box version, you would have the population and the size of the state. Of course, the population changes over time. A little less useful in a 16-year-old edition of the game. Size would generally remain the same. You can see the states are much more iconic in the original out-of-the-box version. In the Broadway Games edition, the state name's a bit smaller. It's a little harder to see when it's actually on the rack, or maybe it's just the light in the rooms in which I'm playing, because the name is almost being subsumed in the rack itself, as opposed to in the old edition where the name was up top. However, you've got a little bit more where the state is actually highlighted in the country, so if you're not sure where something is, which in an edition for a market in Hong Kong is probably a decent idea. You have the landmark, which dresses it up a lot. The planes and cars have fancier illustrations as well. I'm not sure whether that makes a difference to you or not. The cards are roughly the same thickness, although Out of the Box has nice square corners. I always love just being able to throw those down. Got a nice solid feel to them, which is similar in the new edition. The racks are a bit different. In the Out of the Box version, they are wood. Very substantial. It's hard to knock over. The ones in the new edition are plastic, and I found it a little easier just to knock them versus the original. But of course, maybe you're less clumsy than I am. I can understand why you might not want to have the wood versus the plastic. Personal choice. The new version from Broadway Games also includes a card rack so that you can keep the cards organized during play, where you'll have 3 discard piles and then the deck of cards over on the other side. What I found when trying to use this, that it was a little difficult to actually see the states. The sides, while helpful in terms of organizing, was actually obscuring some of the information, or just making it a little more difficult to see what I'm actually trying to look at. So I haven't played with it, but it's there for those who want to use it. And of course you can use it in the box to organize all the cards when you pack everything away. There's a run through of 10 Days in the USA, both old and new. The gameplay retains its charm. I played 3 times on a new edition, again, more than 50 on the old edition. I've played all the other versions multiple times. It's just a fantastically simple design that is also engaging and works very well for 2, 3, or 4 players. Of course, with 2 players, it's very much more about watching what the other player's picking up, trying to cover what you think they can use. With 4 players, it's a bit more random because, of course, there are more cards out of play on other people's racks. And when that happens, this is where main can become useful. Yes, main has a purpose. Yay, main! Mostly because you are often looking to grab particular states in order to complete your tour. And if you were looking for some popular state that has lots of connections to it, it's probably already in someone else's rack, and you are never going to see that because it is already embedded into someone else's tour and not something they're going to give up easily. But for something like Maine or Florida, Washington, other sorts of states, they are often expendable. So it's more likely that someone would give them up, which means if you are building something where you have New Hampshire in that 2nd or 9th slot, maybe you're going to see Maine. There's a good chance that someone will pick it up, not find it useful and discard it, or it's clogging the rack somewhere and then they'll get rid of it, and you can profit from their discards. So the gameplay changes based on the number of players just because of the number of cards that will actually be available to everyone. And so that's something to keep in mind as you're starting to build things. You know, a lot of the transportation is going to be gone, so you have to dig a little deeper, and you can't gamble as much on what you might pull off the deck, just because more is out of play. Whatever the player count, though, it's a fabulous game. And hopefully there will be a US edition. 10 Days in Europe is coming out in a new edition from Broadway. Hopefully that will come out as well. And if not, give it another 10 years. We'll see it on the market in the US at some point.